Welcome, everyone. This is the Geek Constructing Fandoms panel. My name is Erik Didriksen. I am the author of Pop Sonnets, which is a book where pop songs are turned into Elizabethan poetry. To my left are 5 brilliant people whose books are all genius and will be available for purchase in the bookstore after the panel. I will direct you afterwards. Starting with Mr. Jack Wang. He is the co-creator of Star Wars Epic Yarns, a critically acclaimed bookboard series that presents the original Star Wars trilogy in 12 child-friendly words and needle-felted illustrations. Jack and his brother Holman are also the creators of Cozy Classics, a series that presents literary classics in the same 12-word, 12-image format. Jack is also an associate professor in the Department of Writing at Ithaca College in Ithaca, New York. Woo! To his left is Colleen Gleason, a New York Times and USA Today best-selling and award-winning author. Her latest book is The Chess Queen Enigma, the third installment in the Stoker Holmes Series, which follows Sherlock Holmes' niece and Bram Stoker's sister on adventures throughout a steampunk Victorian London. Her other work includes the internationally best-selling Gardella Vampire Chronicles series, among more than 24 novels. To her left is David J. Peterson, a linguist and best-selling author of The Art of Language Invention and Living Language Dothraki. He is best known for creating the Dothraki and Valyrian languages for the hit HBO series Game of Thrones, and has also contributed languages to Defiance, Dominion, and Thor the Dark World, among others. To his left is Ryan Britt, an essayist and the author of the forthcoming book Luke Skywalker Can't Read and Other Geeky Truths. He is the former staff writer for thetor.com, and his work has also appeared in Vice, The Awl, The New York Times, Clarkesworld, Omni, and elsewhere. And last but certainly not least, Caseen Gaines is the award-winning author of We Don't Need Roads, the making of the Back to the Future trilogy. His books, which also include Inside Pee-wee's Playhouse and A Christmas Story Behind the Scenes of a Holiday Classic, have earned him high praise from NPR to People magazine. In addition to writing, Caseen is a theater director, producer, and a high school English teacher in New Jersey. So since we've all sort of approached genre work or a specific series in the past, I'd love to start with what has actually attracted you to what you work with initially as a fan. So, Jack, if you'd like to start.
Well, for those of you who don't know, I'm the creator of, co-creator with my twin brother of Star Wars Epic Yarns. And it recreates the original Star Wars trilogy in needle-felted images, through 12 words. It's also a word primer so that you can introduce Star Wars to children of any age. And do you mind if I just show a few quick pictures? Because this is apropos your question. I'm going to be the guy with the PowerPoint. But I think you'll get a better idea if you... so where's this start slideshow? Yeah, so these are Star Wars Epic Yarns, and these are the 3 covers. And so to answer your questions, my brother and I have been fans for a really long time. I think that's an officially licensed lightsaber from when we were young. You know, we were 5 years old when Star Wars came out, so we've been fans for a long time. And just really quickly, you know, needle felting is when you take loose wool roving and you stab it basically thousands of times with a needle until the fibers entangle and you can sculpt with it. So there you can see Luke Skywalker being felted. We had a technique of removable heads because there are a lot of elaborate costume changes for Epic Yarns. And then what we do is we start building our own sets. And here's the styrofoam core, and then there's some quick set concrete, some painting, some props. And that's the final spread in the book where you have a one word that teaches a simple word and a simple concept to a child, but you also have the child-friendly needle-felted image, and we have each book tells the story in 12 words. So here's another example of in this case, of a droid. And when we don't make sets, we shoot on location. We went to the deserts of Arizona and California. There's my brother, in the Imperial Sand Dunes where Lucas shot some of his scenes from Jedi. And there's me setting up a shot that became the cup. So you can see the needle-felted dolls there being set up. And we had to build the platforms so we could get above the flora and get just sky, and that became the cover of A New Hope. So basically we were fans ever since we were kids, had kids of our own, and said, hey, we want to share Star Wars with our own kids. Let's make some board books. So,
Yeah.
thanks.
Cool.
So I don't have a slideshow. Darn. So I grew up reading Nancy Drew, Trixie Bell, and the Three Investigators. I grew up just loving the mystery genre. And I conceived of the Stoker Holmes series prior to this sort of explosion with the Sherlockness, the Sherlockian world, or whatever you want to call it. So my first book came out 3 years ago, and I was writing it 2 years prior to that. So, but I always felt that there was, for the Sherlock side of it, because there's really 3 parts to my series. There's the Bram Stoker vampire side, there's the Sherlock side, then there's the steampunk element. But I always felt like there wasn't a really good female representative of the Sherlockian sort of mindset. And it was kind of a no-brainer when I started thinking about writing a female set, girl power series set in a steampunk world. You had to have like a Sherlockian character, and by golly, it was going to be a female this time. And then I ended up bringing in a vampire hunter, not because of Buffy so much, but because of my other series, my Gardella series, and then setting it in a steampunk world with alternate Victorian London. That steampunk was just beginning to be understood. I mean, people were still asking me what is steampunk. People still ask me what steampunk is, but the idea of taking those 3 elements and squishing them into one sort of mashup. With all the different things that I had enjoyed throughout my years of reading and being a fan of pop culture. It was really a fun thing to do.
This is cool. Oh, I feel like going into my radio voice on this one. That's an interesting thing that you say there. Blah, 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 blah. Okay, but no, I'll speak loudly. Okay, so I guess what I can comment on is... I created all the languages for Game of Thrones, and I had not actually read any of the books when I was hired to create the languages for the show, or when I won the competition to create the languages for the show. I had heard of them, and I had heard them described, the books described in 2 ways. One, that they are incredibly engrossing and frustrating because your favorite characters are always killed off. I'd heard that, and I'd also heard that heard lots of people say they're great. Don't start them because they're not finished yet. At the time, there were 4 books out. So when I was creating the languages, it was kind of fun because what I ended up doing, in addition to reading the books, and incidentally, by the way, I listened to them on audiobook. I prefer to do it that way. If you haven't listened to them ever, Roy Dotrice is just an amazing reader. Just a sheer pleasure to listen to his delivery of them. But in a sense, in addition to reading the books, I was basically investigating them, or kind of like an archaeologist, learning both about the cultures within the books, and then also basically investigating what the fandom was like. Because well before there was a Game of Thrones TV show, or it was even a conception in anybody's mind, there was a huge fan community for George R.R. Martin that was mainly concentrated in one fan community online, Westeros.org, which had like a huge forum where everybody was talking about theories about what was going to happen in the next book, theories about who Jon's mother was, the whole bit. And so like it had gotten to the point where it's like you get in there and there are just abbreviations for very common fan theories. And so it was like, wow, this is fascinating, because it was kind of like coming in from the very top and trying to get into the fandom at a point where it was already very successful and highly developed. And so actually one of the things I did, I don't know how many times I've mentioned this, but one of the things I did, because this was well before it had been announced that I was creating a Dothraki language. I was strictly under NDAs and everything. I actually joined the forum under a pseudonym and an entirely, I created a fictitious persona. I basically pretended to be a high school student who was like, had just finished reading like the 2nd book and had just found the fan community. I typed in all lowercase. It was great fun. But I was just, I would go on there and kind of like ask questions and try to ferret things out. So whenever I had something that I was coming up against where I didn't know exactly what was going on from the book, I just come on there and, in my typing be like, hey, LOL, like, so I was just reading and I don't quite kind of get this thing, and so like, is this dude, like, is he supposed to be like, like, is he this guy, and like, is he supposed to be the killer and stuff? Like, I don't know, LOL and stuff like that. And and they were very, very kind, by the way, to this person I created. They were very kind and ended up helping me out a whole lot in the beginning. So that was my little entry into George R. R. Martin's fandom, my secret entry.
So anytime I write anything and anyone comments on it with complicated questions, I'm just going to assume it's you. Jack, can you make those dolls of us? Can you do that of us, maybe?
Please.
Like at some
Just
point?
takes like 5 minutes, right?
Yeah, that's easy,
Well,
right?
We have, spare 20 to 60 hours per figure. Yeah, we'll
Lock the doors. What's the question? Well, how we got into like what's the question?
Yeah, what initially brought you into the fandom that you work within?
I was so popular in high school, like I was just really, really popular in high school, and I was just like, I want to get rid of this popularity. I'd like to be interested in things that no one. Yeah, I mean, I think that like many of us, I was like, Star Trek. I talk about this in the first essay of my book, like where like a few years ago, I was like, wow, the Gap sells Star Trek T-shirts. I was like, that I wasn't allowed in the Gap when I was in high school. They're like, you're a nerd. You know what Babylon 5 is. No Gap for you. So I think that, I think that I got into writing about this stuff and being interested in it because, like many people, I was an outcast, but also I think that, I read about so many fandoms: Star Trek, Star Wars, Doctor Who, Jurassic Park, Sherlock Holmes. I love writing about Sherlock Holmes fandom and how it all connects to other ones. It all is so escapist and yet all more real than real, right? Like all this, like fantasy and science fiction when it's best is, it's completely ridiculously unrealistic, but at the same time more representative, right? I had more in common with Data than I did with, anyone on 90210. Though I like 90210 now, so yeah, that's how I feel about it. Over to you, Caseen.
Thank you. I'm not a professional catfisher, so I like that. That's sort of an interesting story. It's like interesting and creepy, but it's interesting. So,
by the way, my handle, I thought it was brilliant. It was Defter. Doesn't that sound like something that like a high school student?
Yeah. Angsty. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Did you say that too? Yeah, lots of angst in high school. So for me, I guess as a kid, I watched a lot of TV and movies, and probably a lot of movies that were for an age range a little bit beyond me. I had a lot of family members that would sit me in front of things and say, you might like this. So like Back to the Future, I watched, which is rated PG, by the way, but if you go through and count the number of S words, and I don't know if this is a G-rated room, if there are kids in here, but it's pretty blue at times, and a kid tries to, his mother tries to sleep with him. For me, I did a lot of reading as a kid, and I always was sort of interested in pop culture books. One of my favorite books as a kid, which is this is going to sound so nerdy, but it was The Twilight Zone Companion by Mark Scott Zachary, which is like this just Bible of Twilight Zone, like an encyclopedia, essentially. It's just a great, great book, and if I can name drop for a second, I'm so honored to have him. He wrote a really nice comment for my book and really enjoyed it, but I was interested not only in these movies, but also in how these things were made. And I gravitated towards really interesting stories about how these movies were made. So for me, the three things I've written about in long form are Pee-wee's Playhouse, A Christmas Story, and Back to the Future. And so the quick trajectory as I see them in my mind is, the Pee-wee's Playhouse story is this guy comes out of nowhere. He has this stage show that's really successful with this character. He gets a movie that everyone thinks isn't going to make any money. Warner Brothers didn't want to release Pee-wee's Big Adventure. Once it was done, they said no one's going to see it, and they were just going to cut their losses. That leads to him doing a TV show, and then, something happens, and, that's all taken away, And so you sort of have this quick ascent and then immediate drop-off story, and that to me was just sort of interesting. A Christmas Story was almost the opposite, where you couldn't see A Christmas Story in the movie theaters on Christmas Day in 1983 when it came out. It was released a couple weeks before Thanksgiving and was such a flop that it was already gone by December. And of course, now there are leg lamps everywhere. There's, you know, there's a 24-hour marathon. It's a huge deal. And so I was sort of interested in looking at how it went from this thing that was dead on arrival to this thing where now I say A Christmas Story and I see all of your smiles and you all are going to go get my book. And then with Back to the Future, it was sort of paradoxical, like no pun intended, but you had a movie that really never went away, you know, for 30 years. It was amazingly successful upon arrival on July 3rd, 1985. But it was a really challenging film to get made. There was another actor who was cast before Michael J. Fox, of course. Crispin Glover was just so incredibly Crispin Glover and weird on set. There was a whole issue with him not returning for part 2. A woman almost died on the set of Back to the Future 2. And so those stories, just while there's a tension on the water, do you mind just pouring me a glass if you don't mind? Thanks. Thank you. And so for me, you know, these are all things that that we are familiar with, but the story behind the 2-hour film, I think, is infinitely more interesting than what we watch. And so for me, I thought it was sort of important to go back and chronicle these things for the fans and also just for history, you know, in a weird sort of way, and interviewing the cast and crew and being able to sort of commemorate the work in long form. And so that's sort of how I came to write my 3.
Great, thank you so much. The big thing about fandoms are the way we sort of delve into them and explore them, and particularly with all of our books in very, very different ways. But I'm really interested in how we manage. Sorry, how we manage to sort of capture the essence of the things we're working with. Particularly, like, there's such a spirit to, like, Back to the Future or to Sherlock Holmes or to Star Wars or to Game of Thrones that it's really important to maintain. We can't just sort of grab the characters and stick them in the Wild West unless it's Back to the Future. So, Colleen, can we start with you?
Yeah, sure. I think the important thing for me when I was working on this world and creating this character in this very beloved, archetype, if you will, the Holmesian archetype, is that I wanted there to be enough elements that were familiar. Sherlock Holmes is known for not telling people what he's thinking. He's known for disguises. He's known for having a sidekick, that kind of a thing. So I wanted to keep a lot of those elements in the story. Drugs? Yeah, that's the books are for 12 and older. She knits instead of plays violin and uses heroin. That's what she does.
There's
so,
an opium den. There's an opium den in the first one.
And there's a connection to the slide that's up on the screen, too.
That's how you beat drugs with...
You knit them.
With
new
handicrafts, yes.
One needle at a time.
In the Tale of Two Cities, huh?
Madame Defarge.
Sorry, we got her derailed. That was terrible. Anyway.
Gentlemen. Anyway, where was I? Oh, so having some of those elements in there, but so it's familiar enough to the reader. Just like when you're writing any kind of genre fiction, we always know at the end of a mystery, the mystery is going to be solved. At the end of the science fiction series or fantasy series, evil's going to be devastated and good's going to win, etc. So I wanted to keep elements of the Holmesian, archetype, but also this is a female now. So we're dealing with petticoats and we're dealing with, corsets and we're dealing with the fact that she, is supposed to go out and find a beau because that's what girls did at that time. And whereas Holmes could go and do whatever he wanted to do at any time and nobody ever questioned him to some extent. So I have both of those elements. I try to balance it in that world. And additionally, I have the Stoker element. The vampires that are very popular now are very much different, as you all know, than the vampires in the Dracula book. But I kind of was hearkening back to the Dracula sort of, the vampires can't go out in the sun, and you stake them with a stake, and they're afraid of silver. So I kept a lot of that the same. But in my books, and you don't actually meet a vampire until the second book of the series. When you stake the vampire, they explode into really disgusting smelling dust that clings to you and gets in your lace and your petticoats and so on. So again, familiarity, but also new little details that kind of blow the world up into something bigger and newer. That's how I approach these two fandoms, because I wanted to make sure that I was true to what the people who love these fandoms, liked about them, but at the same time, I wanted to bring something fresh to it.
So let me ask you. Sorry. So when you prepare to kill a vampire, I mean, does anybody think ahead of time? Say, all right, well, let's put on the hazmat suit. That sounds so marvelously unpleasant. It's just really remarkable. Like, you'd actually think twice about killing a vampire. It's like, is he that bad?
They're all bad, but here's the thing. It's a lot easier than having to deal with a dead body and explain it, you know?
It's just like dust storm.
Yes. And you're like this,
I will mention for something like Game of Thrones, especially for television shows, for movies, I have to say one of the easiest things to do to make sure that there's a certain aesthetic, at least an oral aesthetic, is to actually have created languages. And it's funny to say that's the easiest thing to do because it's a really, really difficult process to create a full language and then have everybody pronounce it and speak it correctly. But it's such a nice thing where it's just like, that there are going to be certain characters that are speaking another language, and if it's created kind of consistently and authentically, then it's going to sound the same. Like, even though they're going to be saying different stuff, every single language kind of has its own music to it, whether it's created or natural. And so it's like it itself becomes part of the set dressing. Even if you're not paying attention to what's being said, it just kind of like sets the mood, and all right, I'm here. I am in this universe. And so it's such a nice thing that Hollywood's paying attention to it now. Ha-ha! Success.
Colleen, can I show you my socks?
Sure.
Ooh, here we go. I have Dracula socks on
Oh,
right now.
oh my God.
Bela Lugosi Dracula.
Can I see?
Oh, they're
Yeah.
great.
Oh, yeah, they're really cool.
Oh my God, he's got blood coming out of his
Yeah,
mouth and everything.
Oh, be careful.
Oh, we have to get a picture of that. I got an Instagram.
Okay,
that.
well,
Before you leave, I get an Instagram.
I just wanted you guys to know that I had vampire socks on.
It's he's drooling
Yeah.
blood.
What are we talking about?
The fandom and how you.
But what was the question exactly?
Getting specifically to like the
Yeah.
essence of what you're working on.
We're hijacking this.
Like how you approach it specifically.
Yeah, I think that I just like the things the way that I like them. Like, I think that it's interesting, like, because I think that everybody, a really good buddy of mine I used to write with at Tor.com named Emily Asher Perrin, one of my colleagues, she wrote a really good piece not long ago about how everybody likes the things that they like differently. And like, you're writing, in the Holmesian, I'm taking this off. You're writing in like the Holmesian universe, and there's so much of that, you know what I mean, and the wonderful, and like, but so many different people have different takes on it. I just read, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's Sherlock Holmes book that was really different, a different take on Mycroft. I wonder if you could team up with him, since Mycroft's daughter
That's right.
is in your book. Yeah.
Yes.
So I mean, but people like the fandom differently, and I like Star Trek or Star Wars differently than maybe you like it, or I like Martin or Tolkien differently than maybe Caseen and I both like Back to the Future, but we might like it differently. So I think that the way I approach it is just be like, it's just part of my biography. It's just like these were my imaginary friends, these were my family members. And I think that just because you write criticism, or you create a language, or you write journalism, or you write, you make yarn dolls, it's like Jack, it sounds like it's like almost autobiographical, like you and your brother, reliving these things. So I always think that in writing about science fiction and fantasy, I'm actually like performing a kind of autobiography. You know what I mean? I'm like, well, these are my feelings. So my approach is completely emotional, and then I try to back it up with some research. That's kind of the way I do it.
I like second to everything that you say. I think it's brilliant. No, I think for me, it always starts with what's most interesting to me, which again may not be what's most interesting to everyone else, but this is I'm chronicling 30 years in a book of this size. So undoubtedly there's thank you. Undoubtedly there's people will email me and they'll say like, oh well, you didn't write enough about this, and I go like, I don't know. I mean you have to sort of balance your own personal interest and what you have information for in a book like this, which is, I think, a little bit more journalistic. But then also, my challenge is to not give you the DVD special features. The Back to the Future trilogy is a very well-documented trilogy, and there are, you know, a bunch of you, if you are even a casual fan, you can repeat some of the stories. And the greatest example of what I'm talking about and sort of my approach to writing this book is the Eric Stoltz situation. Everyone knows that Eric Stoltz, or most people know that Eric Stoltz was the original Marty McFly. And so if you're reading and you get to page 30, or actually I'll say it this way, no one who picks up this book is going to be surprised that on page 1 Eric Stoltz is playing Marty McFly and then he doesn't keep the role. You know, everyone that approaches this book knows that Eric Stoltz does not star in a film called Back to the Future. So you can't really build suspense in that way. But what I can do is say, all right, we know that Eric Stoltz gets fired, but I was more interested in, well, what's it like for someone like Leah Thompson, who worked with Eric Stoltz previously on The Wildlife, was a good friend of Eric's, got the part in Back to the Future because of Eric Stoltz, and now has to continue working on a film where a good friend of hers has been fired. To me, that was a more interesting story, and so when I spoke with Leah, that was the line of questioning that I pursued with her. I was more interested in asking the crew, frankly, what they thought of Eric on set, because the crew has a different level of vested interest in you know, they have a different incentive for telling a fuller version of the truth. I'm trying to choose my words, you can tell. But the producers or director have a different reason for saying Eric was great, it just didn't work out. You know, we all sort of understand that. So my line of questioning about Eric Stoltz only went so far with them because I knew what story I was going to get with those people. And so for me, it really was about trying to look at this really well-documented franchise through a different lens. And I sort of got to curate, based on my interests, where I spent the majority of the time. And I tried to spend it in stories that I thought you knew a little bit about, or you thought maybe you knew, but I'm giving you a much fuller version in the book.
So what my brother and I do is definitely homage, and we actually started with a different series. It's called Cozy Classics, and it takes the same 12-word, 12-image format, except it adapts literary classics. So we started with works, our first 2 titles were Pride and Prejudice and Moby Dick, and now we have many more titles, including Les Mis and War and Peace. And novels, of course, arguably the original fandom. In 1740, there was a novel called Pamela by Samuel Richardson. It's about a servant whose master tries to seduce her. It's hundreds of pages of attempted seduction, which she virtuously resists for the whole thing until they're married at the end.
It's the original 50 Shades of Grey.
Yeah,
Isn't that the basic story?
Basically, it's the original Tales of Ribaldry. Remember that Saturday Night Live skit? Anyways, but my point is that there were like plates and mugs and stuff with Pamela's, pictures sold in the 1740s. This was the original like cross promotional, sort of bonanza here, and so there have been fans, of course, of novels for a long time. And Janeites are big, sort of constituency, big fans of cozy classics. And they're very devoted fans of the world of Jane Austen, and of course, all the, ancillary things that come with that. But with cozy classic was a little bit different, because with cozy classics, when you're adapting a literary work, you can interpret the text visually. And so a lot of our books are kind of mashups in the sense that we, a little bit from this, etching, a little bit from that movie, and you can sort of interpret, because there's no definitive visual representation of the novel. Now, Star Wars, of course, is entirely different. People expect to see Star Wars in a certain idiom. Characters have to be recognizable. You can't interpret too much. And so we tried with Star Wars to be as true as we could in our homage. And in fact, there's a guy at Star Wars, a Lucas. He's called the Keeper of the Holocron. You probably know this, Ryan. But he's basically the fact checker. He keeps all the facts in the Star Wars universe straight. So to give you one example, we had a word. It's the scene in Empire when Han Solo is being frozen, and originally the word was cold. And we were told that, no, actually carbon freezing is a hot freezing process, so the word can't be cold. And so we just we just went with the word frozen. But hot freezing, cold freezing, so frozen. And so there's a fact checker who keeps, the world of Star Wars straight. You can't interpret, too much. But in both cases, I think what we're after is defamiliarization. We're trying to make the familiar new again. Obviously, for kids, it's going to be new to them, but we're trying to appeal to the parents too. And if they can see stories they love through a new lens, if the familiar can be made fresh to them, and arguably people say that's what all literature does. It makes life fresh again to you. The mundane is something you lose attention, toward, and the idea of art is to make the familiar new again. So that's, I think, what we're trying to do in our books.
Can I piggyback on that? That
Sure.
was brilliant. That was absolutely brilliant. I love that. I think that one of the things that I like so much about writing about these things is making the connections of appropriation between things you're familiar with and maybe things you weren't familiar with. I write about The Wrath of Khan in my book in one of the essays, and I talk about how as a kid I didn't know anything about Dickens or Melville. But that movie is like the core of it is Dickens and Melville. Kirk and Spock are reading Tale of Two Cities, and well, Kirk is. Presumably he just now is reading it. He's what, like 40 at that point? Come on, Kirk. But Khan is obsessed with literature. He's obsessed with Milton in the original episode Space Seed, and he's got 2 copies of Paradise Lost on his shelf when Chekhov finds him. Chekhov, literary reference too. And then Khan is quoting Ahab and from Moby Dick at the end. And I remember just thinking how great that was when I realized that. And I don't know, like everything you just said I thought was great is the idea that the things we love sometimes are taking the familiar and making it new again. And obviously you're doing Stoker, Bram Stoker and Conan Doyle at the same time. I don't know, I just think that is exactly everything that I like about what we get to do is that familiar, but then now it's mine. Yeah.
I just want to jump in really quick because I'm fascinated by the language development and partly because of the Lord of the Rings, obviously, and all of that, and partly because in the book that I was writing, or that I'm writing, this series, I alternate between the 2 main females' points of view in the first person, and so I had to work on their language and their cadence to make sure that they sounded different. And I also came up with some specific words that were specific to this book and this world, their slang words or whatever. But could you just talk about when you were developing, and I'm sorry I'm hijacking, but you said we could. I would like to know.
He did?
He did. He told me that I could hijack. It was strongly
She's
applied.
got hijacking power. We don't
But what I'm curious is when you were working on these languages for Game of Thrones, and I have to confess I'm not a Game of Thrones watcher or reader yet, but did you start with a Germanic language or another type of language and then build from it, or how did you? Can you just give us a couple minute info? Or
Yep.
High level thing.
Yeah, sure.
High level thing.
Yeah, I'll try to do this as quickly as possible. So, generally, as a language creator, so I had been creating languages for 10 years before I started working on Game of Thrones, just doing it for fun. And there are thousands of people that create languages all over the world just for fun. Very, very few who get paid to do it, but I know that many, many would like to. So, by the way, any authors out there, any authors of fantasy or sci-fi, if you're looking for somebody to create a language for you, there are people out there. Contact me. I'll get you the right person. Anyway, so, well, yes, like me, but ideally other people so that we can get more people working. Come on. They can't give me an Emmy if I'm just competing against myself. Anyway, it's true. But anyway, so
Tweet that. What are you guys doing?
Morris of a humble brag.
Oh man. That's true. Okay, so as a language creator, I kind of went through a process of learning. So one of the things that I did at the very beginning was when you find a language that you really, really like or you're really just burning on at the moment, Turkish was one for me, Swahili was one for me, Hawaiian was one for me. You kind of at the beginning, you start like creating a language that was like it to try to figure it out, to like get in the headspace and figure out how that language works, not just how you use it, but how it would feel, to kind of like be it and evolve it in a way. But at a certain point, you kind of you grow out of that phase, and you get to a point where it's like you get an idea for exactly how languages can vary. It is, especially human languages, they can vary in a certain number of ways, so like infinitely, but in predictable ways. And so at that point, you can just kind of go top down and start with the parameters themselves and say, all right, what am I going to do with this language? How do I want it to feel when you write and use it? Is this going to be a language that relies on articles a lot, the way that our languages does, the way that German does, and the Romance languages do? Or is this going to be a language that relies on cases? Is there going to be really big fat verbs that have a lot of head marking in them, marking objects, direct objects, indirect objects? Or is it going to be simpler verbs that are supported by a lot of auxiliaries and particles? You kind of get the sense for what it's like to use each of these different types of languages. And so when you're working with a new project, you can kind of say, all right, what do I want to do with this? How do I want it to feel? And then go from there. And actually totally just start top down and do it without making reference to any natural language. The end result, kind of per force, will end up looking like other languages on Earth. For example, the Caseen language I created for Defiance, it looks in many ways kind of like Turkish and kind of like Japanese, and those two languages are actually similar in a lot of ways. But it didn't do so on purpose. It just does that because it's Caseen is a largely head final language that that is kind of inflectional and does some other certain things. So it's like, that's kind of the process, or that's like the 2-minute version of the process that lasts several months of hard, intensive work, but that's super, super fun. It's so much fun.
Another question?
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we all like your. This is interesting. So, all right. So the word Ewok, right? Never spoken aloud in Return of the Jedi, right? Like that's weird, right? Weird, right? Like, how do we all know that? Good marketing. But I guess I'm wondering. So you've got like primarily like people, right? Like people like head, 2 legs, 2 arms, whatever. What about like animals, like Ewoks and stuff like that? Like how would they even approach that? Is that not legit? Like, are those languages not legit? Like, in your opinion?
Yeah, definitely not legitimate. But they're.
Ewok is fake.
I mean, yeah, definitely. But it's cool to listen to. I love hearing them. I mean, come on. I was born in 1981, so I grew up with Return of the Jedi.
That was your first language.
There you go. But yeah, no, that's a very interesting question, because I'll always get this, like, especially when I'm doing alien languages. It's like I start with the aliens and say, all right, well, how alien are they? Right. I mean, their skin is a different color. Great. Their eyes are a different color. Their hair is a different color. They have ridges on their forehead. It's like, great. Do they still have a larynx? Do they still have an alveolar ridge? Do they still have teeth? Do they still, like, raise their young, for example? And so it's like, it doesn't matter if you have a third lung, if it's still just air coming out of your lungs and passing through your glottis and everything like that. So it's a question of how alien are they, and they tend to be kind of alien in some of the visual ways, but not really in the linguistically relevant ways. And so what you end up doing is producing a more or less human language for these more or less, if we're being honest, human characters that just happens to make reference to, like, alien plants and animals. By the way, that was the most fun thing and easiest trick for me on Defiance. If I ever wanted to create a word for something like, I don't know, like slimy or quick or something that was adjectival, I could always just create an alien animal and say, this is the word for that alien animal, and then derive the adjective from it. So it's, so rather than say like rat-like, it was blurt-like. And it was like, well, what's a blurt? Well, it was just on their home world, which of course has been destroyed at this point in the series, so we'll never see it. That was always lots of fun. I would love to get in there and do like a really alien language, something for like where beings like they didn't even like raise their young, for example, like they reproduced in a way where like their young were immediately competitive to them, so they like tried to stay away from other beings as much as possible. So it's like language was almost used as a defense mechanism rather than a way to bond. It's a way to like kind of telegraph your intentions and keep people away and things like that. Even if they had to get together for only really specific purposes, languages would end up being really different. in that scenario. And thus far, well, at least in TV, I haven't gotten anybody that was alien enough to really warrant an alien language. I'd love to give it a try, though. And I'll give you an example of actually a really nice one. Really easy one to just look up, and you can just look at it and see, oh, wow, that's different without going into the details. There's a language called Rikchik by a fellow named Dennis Moskowitz, and he created this language for these aliens that have a great big globe with one eye. They don't have ears or a mouth. Then they have 49 tentacles that hang down below them, and 7 of them are shorter, and they can use them like arms. So he created a language for these aliens. Naturally, it's completely unspoken because they don't have mouths and ears. They use those 7 tentacles and form them into glyphs, and then basically kind of like a glyph, 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 and he created an alien language for them that, while you can use it as a human, if you kind of write down with his little writing system, I mean, we can't sign it. We lack the necessary appendages. So, but yeah, that's alien. You know what I mean? Haven't gotten a chance to do it. Would really love to. All right.
So I'd like to turn it over to all of you if you've got questions for our lovely panel here. This gentleman in front.
Hi. Yeah. So I figure you're interacting with the fandoms that you're a part of. How do you think? I think in just even in the last 10 years, there's been a big change with how interactive things are because of the internet. You have Tumblr, Reddit, DeviantArt, all these different like social media platforms that fans can interact with each other and with creators. And I guess how do you think that's changed the way you interact with the medium that you work in?
I'm gonna jump in with that one. Sorry. I think it's interesting. Back to the Future right now is a perfect case study with what's going on. I tried so desperately. Anyone out there have a Pepsi Perfect? Anyone get one? I'll like buy it from you. Let's talk after this. I'm not. I'll trade you like 30 books. So I think it's really interesting the way that the studio is sort of having this reciprocal relationship with the fandom. The creators, it's so funny. The day that I spoke with Bob Zemeckis, he took the phone call like 2 minutes late and said that he was just catching up on his email, and Bob Gale, the co-creator along with Bob Zemeckis, had just sent him a Funny or Die link of Biff Tannen winning Warren Buffett's prediction for the NCAA bracket or something like that, with the Sports Almanac. And Zemeckis says to me, like, Bob Gale's always sending me the craziest stuff, and I'm on this mailing list now, so I see Bob Gale does send the craziest stuff, but it's funny because they're so plugged in to the fandom. So Pepsi now has this limited run of Pepsi bottles. They just released a trailer for Jaws 19. You may have seen. That's a Universal thing, all in promotion for the 30th anniversary. And so much is because fans have demanded it or fans have speculated about it. There's so much hay that's made this year about, what predictions did they get right in Back to the Future Part 2? And the reality is very, very little. People shot for having hoverboards created by 2015 because of the film, not just, Bob Gale and Bob Zemeckis were geniuses that happened to predict the exact year Lexus was going to come out with a hoverboard. So it's interesting to see the way... and I know, not just myself, but I know myself and a couple of other people that have access to these filmmakers now are able to see posts on Facebook and on Instagram and conversations and go to the creators and say, like, how do you feel about this? And then go back and sort of weigh in on the conversation and say, this is sort of what Bob Gale thinks about it. Take it as you will. A great example of that is in Back to the Future 2. You guys, everyone's seen Back to the Future, right? Yes? Okay. So in Back to the Future 2, because I'm spoiling something, sorry, so just cover your ears if you don't, it's a 30-year-old movie. But in Back to the Future 2, they go back and they revisit Back to the Future, a whole sequence from the first film. And you see in Part 2, a scene from Part 1 from a different perspective, Biff Tannen, the bully, spiking the punch at the school dance. Now, in the first film, unrelated to this sequence that we see in part 2. In the first film, there's a very clear shot of George McFly, Marty's father, pouring himself some of the punch before he goes and interrupts Biff Tannen at the in the car where, during the attempted date rape moment, in this PG movie. And so there's this, Gawker or someone did, is this, look, this thing that everyone missed in Back to the Future 2, there's justification, the argument being that Crispin's character had, liquid courage, and that's why he goes and punches out Biff. So I take this article and I go, wow, this is amazing. Those writers are so clever. I send this to Bob Gale. Bob Gale says, wow, that's a really smart thing. I wish we were that clever. He said, I wish it were deliberate. And we would certainly never advocate that to do the right thing, you need to, be drunk to do it. But I love that people have found that, and that's a connection that people can make. But now you have this, again, the circle sort of is completed now. It's a really long-winded answer, but I think that that's sort of what's going on. I notice also with Jack's books that they're officially licensed, so there's a different level of appreciation for a fan product or something that fans would appreciate outside of just the films. And I think that the Star Wars franchise obviously does that really well too.
I just, real quick, one sentence. I just want to mention the Veronica Mars Kickstarter campaign. I mean, right there.
Yep.
Yeah,
that's a great example.
It's also like, I think that something to remember is that the media, the specific medium of how we interact, like with the big creators, has changed. But if you go back to the 90s and you consider the fact that Ron Moore was a fan of Star Trek who sold a spec script and then became a staff writer and then made Battlestar Galactica, like that's a ground up guy. Like that was a guy off the street. Like he was not connected. Like that's a fan creating it. Like J.J. Abrams is like a fan. Russell T. Davies was a Doctor Who fan who brought Doctor Who back. Right. Yeah, Jason Segel and the Muppets. That's a good example. So like I think that the way it interacts and that Jack's a good microcosm of that. I think. Sherlock Holmes fans have been doing this for 100 years. Like hey, I'm writing my own Sherlock Holmes book.
And a lot of them are doing it in the last 5 years.
That's right.
Like,
that's right. Yeah,
how many iterations of Sherlock Holmes can you have?
But I guess that there's a long history. I think I think that because we have the internet now, it's more direct, right? So it seems different, but it's been going on for a long time.
Yeah, I work on, by the way, 2 different shows that have totally different representation. So like Game of Thrones, Dave and Dan do absolutely no social media, and they really don't. They don't look at anything at all. Then you have the 100, where Jason Rothenberg is constantly interacting with fans, and in some cases making them quite upset. If any fans of the 100, if you're a Bell Arc shipper, I'm sorry. But anyway, really strange and interesting world we live in, and my advice is always to both parties, the creators and the fans, just be kind. Remember that there's love there. Be kind.
Yeah, I just want to add that for kids' books, of course, it's a little bit different. Children need the tactile reality of books. They're not out there on the internet. But the original sort of fandom for kids is dramatic play. And I give my daughters Pride and Prejudice, and suddenly they're Lizzie and Jane playing, acting out these roles. And I've had a lot of lightsaber fights with my daughters, and they really like to, cut off all my limbs, one by one until I'm just a stump. But
tis just a flesh wound.
But that's where fandom starts, with kids and dramatic play.
First here, you're on deck.
Hi, thank you so much. I was just wondering, and I think that this nicely curtails, fans we've seen have a lot of power in making things and bringing things back, but do you think that fandoms can also kill a universe, that a certain media or video book can be defined in a certain way and people love it for this one thing, and if it tries to evolve or change in some way, that the fans can just get really mad? I'm probably being specifically at Enterprises, the Star Trek that killed Trek because fans were so mad.
Right, but I found nothing but people who love Enterprise, and since I started writing about it, when I was writing staff at Tor.com, is like all I did was write about how it just if it had been on a few years longer, that wouldn't have been the case. You know what I mean? It took a while, but Yeah, I mean, the weird thing is it's like at the time, I think that's the perception because enough people said, it was terrible and there was enough loud voices that said it. But then you talk to actual fans, like I wrote like top 5 Enterprise episodes I love. And people were like, I know, I love Enterprise too. You know what I mean? And so I think that there's myths that get perpetuated of like, oh, this movie sucks, like nobody likes this movie. But then when you start talking to people, you're like, actually, that's not true at all. You know what I mean? Like, and Terra Nova is a funny example of that. That was a show that had great ratings. And it was perceived to be this terrible show, and it's really not that terrible. It's got dinosaurs in it, guys. Like, it was a TV show. Every week there was dinosaurs. What was the problem? But yeah, that was a show that was perceived to be unpopular. That was not unpopular. You're the only Terra Nova fan, so maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, I was going to say that it's a tough thing, actually, especially with social media for writers. Like, they always get these orders, especially not to look at any like fan scripts or like, oh, we were wondering if you could do this plot line, like not to even look at them, because then you get into this whole slew of legal problems where if it actually happens in the show that there could be something actionable there if it can be proved that you knew about the storyline ahead of time and that a fan created it. So they have to be like really, really touch and go there and kind of like gauge the interests of fans without actually looking at anything very specific. I will say, though, that in my experience, they tend to not really be super responsive. Like, they know what the fans like, but they still tend to do what they like and what they plan. Or if we're talking about Warehouse 13, like something they were told to do. If anybody was a Warehouse 13 fan, yikes, that 5th season. But anyway, but hey, we still love it, though. I mean, and I think that if anything, like the 5th season even caused the fandom to grow of Warehouse 13 because they just realized, oh, we loved what was before so much. So I don't know, it's a double-edged sword, careful thing, and lawsuits and whatnot.
I just want to say I totally agree with what you just said about not looking or hearing or what's going on out there, because as a novelist, I have fans that are always talking about my books and what they think should happen, what they want to happen, and I don't pay attention to it. I can't listen to it. I have to already know what's going to happen. This is for me. I don't know how everybody else feels, but ahead in the story, I don't want to be influenced by the fandom, because then they aren't going to be as surprised. It won't be as fresh to them if I don't continue to go with my original plans, if that makes sense. So I think there's a very fine line between interacting with the fandom or the readers or the watchers or whoever, and interacting without, letting that drive what is going to happen.
Gentleman over here, and then you're on deck.
I forgot the first half, but I wanted to say something about it. What was the first half?
Social media.
Yeah. Social media. Social media. Well, now that you all are following me on Instagram, no, I think in terms of Back to the Future, the community is really on Facebook. It seems. It's funny because very early on, there was a fan community on backtothefuture.com, formerly at bttf.com. And that's really where, like, I'm talking early internet, like 1994, 1995, and that was one of the first ways in which the filmmakers realized that people were still talking about this movie. They sort of stumbled across it on the internet and saw people in, these old school message boards. But right now, it seems like there are a lot of groups on Facebook, and that's really where the action is, for Back to the Future at least. In regards to the second half of your question, I think that what the internet has done is make the world so much smaller. It's so cliche to say, but I grew up a lot of my life being a really big Pee Wee Herman fan, and you feel like you're the only Pee Wee Herman fan when you're a Pee Wee Herman fan in like 1997. You feel like you're the only one, and so the internet brings you know, you're able to find like-minded people. Similarly, you find out that other people like the things that you like as well, and then they're not so weird. When I spoke with Leah Thompson, she said that after Back to the Future, the #1 8x10 glossy that she's asked to sign, some of you know where I'm going already, is Howard the Duck. Is her Howard the Duck, you know, shot. And so, what a great movie. And so we could just do a whole Howard the Duck panel. Yeah. We'll get George Lucas for that one. But in that case, you know, she says that people all the time, if it's not Back to the Future, they want to talk to her about Howard the Duck. And that, you know, there's a really strong fandom for that. But there are people that either like it because it's maligned, or they like it because, you know, they have poor taste. I don't know what it is exactly, but I think that sort of gets to the second half of your question, I think. I've been talking so long, I've lost track of the question.
You know what I think it is I'm remembering a time that, this is in my book, is very briefly, is that I waited on Kim Cattrall once when I was a waiter in Manhattan. Kim Cattrall is probably most famous for Sex and the City, but I asked her about Star Trek VI. And I'm like pouring her free wine, and she's like, yeah, it was great. But I think that part of what makes cult classics, you're talking about like cult classics, movies that are flops or phenomena that are flops or whatever, like I think humor has something to do with it, and that pop culture has been around for long enough that like pop culture has gotten to a point where it has a sense of humor about itself. You know, and like humor is related to homage. Like the fact that Jack can even do what he does is because pop culture is just grown up a little bit, right? It's like now we've seen the simulacrums of the various things so many times. We've seen the image of Holmes or whatever. We've seen the image of like a wizard so many times that now we have like a sense of irony and humor about it, which is how we continue to make. Like, how the hell was there a Mad Max movie made? Because there's been the culture has been around long enough where it was time for Mad Max to skewer itself, right? To almost mock its own premise, and in doing so make a great film. You know what I mean? But I think that Jaws 19, yeah, right, exactly. But I think that it's because of time and sort of like a sense of irony about it that helps to make that go. That's my thought.
I'm just going to throw out a quick recommendation if we're going to talk about a new cult classic. I'm going to try to be an influencer. Go watch the movie Debs. It's amazing.
Yes. All right, that's it.
I just wanted to, as I speculate on the fly to in response to that question, I think that there's probably tension between wanting to like something that a lot of people like, and then wanting something that's kind of your own, that not everybody likes. So I think for anything that's popular, there's always a phase where there are early adopters. And there are people who just want to find their thing, and they don't want everybody else to like it. So almost by definition, you can't like in that same way something that's a hit instantly. You know, that's at 1,000 megaplexes on the first weekend. Almost by definition, those early adopters have to seek out something that's neglected and forgotten and make it their own. And then that somehow strengthens the solidarity of the like-minded. And you know, almost by definition, you have to find a flop to do that. You know, to have that special, you know, the specialness of discovery.
Or I'm sorry, it was just specifically to that point. I promise I will be so quick. But I was gonna say it's also, or things that are more on the fringe, like Rocky Horror, which is what was in the question, and it was similar with Pee-wee's Big Adventure too. I mean, that was a film that wasn't on a lot of screens, but that character is so bizarre. Yeah. That's my time. You're staring me down.
I was just going to say the Rocky Horror was exactly what I was going to say. The reason that's a cult classic is because everyone was going to it when they were high and drunk in college at the midnight movie, and half of the reason that it's a cult classic is because, you know, nobody really remembered what it was about, and because you had fun. It was a social event. It wasn't the movie. It was a social event. The costumes and the blah blah blah. So.
Yeah. All right. We unfortunately only have 5 minutes left. So one last question.
I mentioned that I waited tables at one point with Kim Cattrall. Yeah, I mean, I've been a working writer for like 5 years, but I have a lot of odd jobs. I'm actually waiting tables this evening.
Where?
You know, like I'm in Park Slope. 5th and 15th. Yeah, I mean, my book's coming out with Plume, which is Penguin Random House. But, you know, in order to write a book, you know, you have to quit your day job for a little while, and so you do a lot of odd jobs, you know. I was a staff writer at Tor.com, which is a science fiction blog, for 3 years. But I was a freelancer before that, writing for Nerve.com and many other places. And I'm a freelancer now. You know, I write for Vice sometimes. I write for the Morning News. I teach writing. But, you know, sometimes it's just you have to make ends meet, you know. So the funding came from the willingness to be poor, I suppose.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I have a day job, as Erik mentioned. I teach at Ithaca College, and I'm fortunate that that pays the bills. And I'm actually first and foremost a fiction writer. I write my own, literary fiction, and so this is kind of my third job, as it were, being a children's author and illustrator. My brother, he was a lawyer, so when we were working on Cozy Classics, we were both working day jobs and doing this on the side until it got off the ground. He was a lawyer, and he was, working late at night, after the kids had gone to bed, working on these felt figures, as was I, and he's the primary illustrator, and so he did more of the set building and the photography, and right now he's trying to make a go of it. He quit his job as a lawyer, chose happiness, yeah. I think he thinks everyone should quit the law. Any of you who are lawyers probably know how he feels. But in any case, he's trying to make a go of it now, and it's not always easy, but fortunately we did get some advances, for example, to do the Star Wars books. But yeah, I mean, it's as Ryan's suggesting, you have to often cobble jobs together and make a go of it.
I'll just say quickly that I started creating languages when I was in college, and then I went to graduate school, as did my wife. We both went to linguistics graduate school, and then I was just creating languages all the while. After that, I taught at community college and got paid next to nothing, and she worked at a job 60 hours a week and got paid next to nothing. And combined, and living within our means, we almost made, I guess, like next to nothing. How does that work? I don't know.
You made nothing.
Nothing. No, yes, we made nothing. We made nothing.
Nothing's making nothing.
Right, and so
Right?
but I was just creating languages the entire time on the side, and that's what I did. And it seems like, especially if you can find somebody, some significant other that is willing to give you their next to nothing, and you can kind of like eke out an existence together and maybe watch a movie once every 7 months. I mean, it can work.
Love is the answer?
Love is the answer.
Yep.
I worked full-time and wrote in the evenings until I sold my first book. I'm fortunate enough to be a full-time writer right now, but I'm married and my husband helps provide that other next to nothing.
Oh, and I just also want to mention really quick, since I know we're very close to our time, if you haven't heard of it yet, pull up your phone or whatever you have, Google Pop Sonnets. You will be amazed. Yeah. Amazed.
I'm fortunate enough to be a school teacher. The profession everyone loves.
By the way,
school teachers.
School teachers. Yes.
And they're teachers in the house. Good for you guys. Go us. And so I have the benefit of having summers to do a lot of writing. It's I find, I guess, another way of asking that question, and what I get asked quite a bit, is how do you find time to do it? Because I write and I do theater and I teach, which is a super full-time job. And I just think everyone makes time for what they want to make time for, for what they want to do. There are some people that go to the movies every day. There are some people that binge watch a different series on Netflix every month or every week or whatever. Everyone uses, so there are some people that sleep till noon. However you prioritize your 24 hours, and I choose to do it creating. It's really what fulfills me, and that's why I keep doing it.